Today is November 9th, 2007. We're doing an oral history interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. I'm Charles Lundquist. Our guest today is Charles Mauldin, who's an old timer at the Marshall Center. Charles, it's good to have you here today.
Glad to be here.
What we'd like to do is start out by letting you tell where you were raised, where you went to school, and how you got into the space program. Can you do that, please?
I believe so. Born in Birmingham, Alabama. Went to Phillips High School, then Auburn University. While there, going through Auburn, I was a co-op student with Southern Bell Telephone Company there in Birmingham. Graduated from Auburn in December of '60, and I participated in the ROTC program at Auburn, and thus I had a 2-year military obligation that I had to honor before I really became fully employed. And I interviewed several folks down at Auburn. Most of them wanted me to come back after I got out of service. I had a 4-month time delay before I went into service. And the one outfit that came forward and said, "We'd like to have you right now," was NASA in Huntsville. And they talked me into coming to the Marshall Center with an understanding that after the 4-month period and I went on active duty, they would put me on military leave for the full 2 years, and I would be eligible for raises, etc., during the 2-year time period that I was gone.
That was a very generous arrangement.
It certainly was. They were staffing up the Marshall Center, and they had a particular need for electrical engineers, which was my major.
So what did you do when you were in the military?
I was stationed at a missile master site which controlled Nike Hercules missiles in a racetrack around the Boston, Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island area. It was the center of the electronic arena for designating targets to the missile batteries such that they wouldn't expend more than one missile on a target.
So you got some practical experience
in rocketry. And that was key towards advancing the career. NASA took note of that, you know, the technical aspect of my military service as well.
So when you came back to Marshall, where did you get assigned?
In Components Test Laboratory. I spent the time from '63 to '68 in test lab and designing control systems to test rocket engines, model rocket engines, and components of engines like gas generators and thrust chambers and that kind of thing. It was kind of basic engineering stuff, relays, power supplies, control switches, that type of thing.
Who did you work with in the test lab at that time?
Carl Heimberg was the chief over there, and Bernard Tessman was the deputy.
Those were very active people.
Yes, they were.
Well, then what did you do?
Well, what happened is Kennedy Space Center got into a personnel problem area having to do with processing the first Saturn V's through the launch facility. And they appealed to Marshall to provide them with some technical folks to help them ameliorate their problem with getting the stuff processed, and actually they came and asked for volunteers to go down to the Cape for 6 months. And at the time, my children weren't in school, and it would have been a burden on any of the rest of the guys to go, so I volunteered to go for 6 months. That was in 1968, and I was there from February to August, and processed through 501 and 502, the first Saturn V's, and actually was on a console at the Cape during the flight of of 502, the second Saturn V that we flew.
Those were exciting days.
Yes, they were. There's a lot of unknowns when you fly one of those things off for the first time, and nobody's ever had one in the air before.
Yeah. Any particular memories you'd like to mention from that period?
Well, we had an excellent cadre of folks, and everybody was focused. That was particularly invigorating, and it worked really well for me, being from a design organization, to see how the stuff that we were designing played in with the launch vehicle. And fortuitously, if I can go ahead just
Please
a
do.
little bit, on my return, I had attracted enough attention that folks asked me if I'd transfer to the Astor Onyx laboratory, where the design of those vehicle electrical systems was taking place. So I did make that move and wound up being assigned as a project engineer on electrical systems for the S4B stage, the third stage of the Saturn V, and working with the same guys that I had worked with on the KSC end. So it worked really well, because I knew what they were up against, and they could telephone me and ask for a particular design change that might help their way of doing business, and we were usually able to accommodate them.
That was a very efficient arrangement.
Yeah, it was. So that was the fall of '68 that I went to Astor Onyx Laboratory.
So who headed Astor Onyx at that time?
Hauserman, Walter Hauserman.
Waterman. Another very active person.
Yes, absolutely. He was involved in the day-to-day activities. He'd come over to my office and just walk in, see what we were doing. He was a real disciplinarian. He had bells that rung at the start of work and a bell that rung when it was over.
Oh, really?
Like we were working in a factory.
Nobody had ever mentioned that before.
It kind of struck me as something that must have come from having worked in a manufacturing area before. But I was in the electrical division there under Bob Aiden, who was the division chief there. And we had some excellent people too. There's no question about that.
Well, so the systems you designed eventually flew.
I got to see them fly. I wound up being in launch support for all of the Saturn vehicles from the time that I came to Astor Onyx until I left. Some of the time I was at the Cape on site for the launches, and other times I was in the Huntsville Operations Support Center, the HOSC.
Mm-hmm. Well, what interesting memories do you have from that period?
In particular, the Apollo 17 launch. I was at the HOSC when we got a cutoff in the launch countdown very late, because a relay contact in electrical support equipment did not close properly, and so I wound up, while we were in a extended launch hold, being one of the key members of the team that gave Marshall management and NASA management the confidence to go ahead with the launch. I mean, it was an unusual situation. It was a night launch on one that we had, and to get shut down late and to be over there in that kind of a situation. But fortunately, we had the drawings, and we had a few cues as to what might have gone wrong, and we were able to verify that. We ran some simulations, and we had a full systems development lab on site here at Marshall with all of the ground support equipment, electronics, and a vehicle simulator, and we were able to run our proposed solution against it. And so we went ahead and launched. That was the last Lunar launch.
Now, that was the one where Jack Schmidt the only geologist to ever go to the moon. Went to the moon.
Right. That IMDT, I remember that, Schmidt. Yeah.
And that was a interesting mission with a real geologist walking around on the moon.
Well, he rode part of the time too.
Yeah, he did.
Matter of fact, I was the project engineer on the electrical systems for the Lunar roving vehicle.
Oh, really?
The S4B had gotten fairly routine, and they saw an opportunity to move me over onto the LRV. As a matter of fact, I was a member of what they call the Lunar Roving Vehicle Quick Response Team at the HOSC. We worked directly with mission control, and any anomaly or any question that came up on the LRV, we were there to answer that, and there were several.
What kind of questions came up?
Like, why does the amp hour integrators, which is the battery fuel gauge, so to speak, why does it look like the batteries are charging instead of discharging as we ride along?
that is strange, all right.
It is, and it was an anomaly that should not have occurred, but we were able to keep enough continuum records on how much power was actually being used that we provided a backup to those things.
That's an amusing little tale.
It is.
I had never heard that before.
Well, another one is there was the way the thing worked, the astronauts would call mission control. Mission control was supposed to provide the response, but what they did is they turned around and talked to us on the LRV Quick Response Team, formulated an answer, and got back. Well, John Glenn, on one question he asked about circuit breakers and how we were controlling power, got impatient. He didn't get an answer right away, so he started flipping switches.
Oh, really?
That's John. I know him.
That was on an earlier mission, of course.
No, this was, that's true.
John Glenn wasn't on.
No, that was Gene Cernan on the last one.
Right.
Yeah, he was on 16. John was.
Yeah.
But that was funny. Fortunately, things were locked out to such an extent that he couldn't cause any damage, but the fact that he would on his own just start throwing switches on the console.
Well, the astronauts have mind of their own sometimes. Oh, when the Apollo lunar landings were over, what did you do next?
I was asked to go and work solid rocket booster integration on the space shuttle. They had formed a systems engineering team for that, and they wanted somebody to work electrical networks for the solid rocket booster. So that's where I went, and I think that was 1973.
That's another challenging job.
That turned out to be a very challenging job, since the SRB was designed totally in-house. Every bit of the design was done with Marshall engineers. We had, of course, a contractor for the solid rocket motor, but I'm talking about the active components, the thrust vector control system, separation system, ignition systems.
Yeah, all of which is very necessary.
Right, and there was a considerable amount of electrical networks on that. I worked for a fellow named Clyde Nevins at that time, and as a matter of fact, I wound up taking his job in 1976 as the chief of SRB integration, and kept that for quite a few years. Of course, we launched in 81, so I had it for 5 years before we launched the first shuttle.
And it all worked well.
It was unbelievable. I had met Bob Crippen, one of the astronauts, he and John Glenn, on the first shuttle mission, and to see, he came around with us to the design meetings, and he would come ask me about how things were working and try to develop a level of confidence in some of this stuff. And I remember in particular talking to him about the ignition safe and arm device on the boosters and telling him how it worked and how we verified it and made sure that if we got a firing command that the booster was going to go. And to see him and Glenn strap themselves into a vehicle that had never flown before. You know, Saturn V's we had at least flown a couple before we
couple
put
unmanned, quite a few actually.
Yeah, at 501 and 502 before 503, 4, 5, and but anyway, to see him and Glenn strap themselves into that thing, and it came off the pad, and the first thing we do is a roll maneuver because we used the Saturn V launch platforms, launch sites, and the way they were oriented, we couldn't go right out over the ocean. You came up and you make a 90-degree turn, roll with the cockpit down and everything, and take off. And the thing, when it came off the pad, it looked like a snap rope just as we cleared the tower. The guidance equations were, I mean, it worked, but it was unnecessary stress on the vehicle as it turned to go out of it. Absolutely, and it was rather frightening. I can imagine how Bob Crippen felt when that was going on. I talked to him some about that later, and he said, "Well, we just had confidence it was going to work, Charlie."
And it did.
It did. It did.
So how many Saturn flights were you involved in?
Well, you mean shuttle
flights. I'm sorry, shuttle flights.
I was on an engineering console as the SRB integration chief in the Launch Control Center for all of the launches up through Challenger, and subsequent to that, I was on the console as Director of System Safety and Reliability for however many it takes to make 61. I've been on the engineering console and engineering console in the Launch Control Center for 61 space shuttle launches.
Well, that's a lot. Not many people can say that.
No, not from Marshall.
Not from Marshall.
Not from Marshall.
Well, any interesting incidents or anecdotes from that period?
Well, of course, I was on the. Well, let me give you one a little more challenging and not exactly frightening, but the STS6 flight, which was, no, it was STS4, I'm sorry. We lost 2 solid rocket boosters because the sensor, it's called an impact switch, that detects water impact and detaches the main parachutes the way it worked back then, reacted to the separation of the frustum when we blew that ordnance on the boosters, and for some strange reason it hadn't happened the first 3 flights, but on the 4th flight they reacted and the parachutes flew off at the same time we blew the frustum, and we lost 2 boosters in the ocean. It took a while to figure that one out, but we did, and we took the impact switch out of that logic so that it couldn't do that again. But of course,
the mission went on anyway.
Oh, of course, yeah. That wasn't a problem. I mean, we just lost a set of flight hardware, 2 solid rocket boosters. Mm-hmm. But of course, the big one, and the one that wound up making a big career change for me, was being on the console for Challenger.
That was a very sad occasion.
Yeah, it was. We had gone out to launch 2 days before, and didn't launch. We scrubbed, and we bypassed the second day because the weather forecast was unfavorable. But it turned out that the next day was beautiful, and we could have launched. And there was a lot of consternation, press coverage and everything. NASA don't know what they're doing, that kind of stuff. So we go out there on the morning of January 28th, and I went into the firing room and looked at the TV monitors, and we had people out there breaking icicles off of the mobile launch facility.
Oh my!
And sweeping them up and sweeping them over to the side. And I sat there and listened to what was going on. That, you know, the concerns about blowback off of the pad, taking icicles up and damaging the orbiter tiles and all of that kind of stuff for a while. And I finally told my contractor counterpart that was sitting next to him, I said, we're not launching today, I'm going home. So I put my headset in my briefcase, started for the firing room door, and he says, Charlie, you better come back here. Says, they're talking about launching. And I got back on, and I hear Arnie Aldrich, the program manager, asking, where is it written that says that I can't launch when I've got low temperatures and icicles on the pad? And everybody was just dumbfounded, because you don't write up almost impossible things as something you don't launch in. That's supposed to be common sense. But anyway, after a long series of conversations, we went ahead and launched the thing. I knew about the concern with the O-rings. I had been in every SRB flight readiness review, and the things were not designed to operate at that temperature. They had had a Telecon the night before. I wasn't involved in it because my forte was systems engineering. It didn't have anything to do with O-ring design or solid rocket motor field joints and that kind of thing. But sitting there, it goes off the pad. I'm looking at my data screen, and all of a sudden it stopped updating. And I thought, what's going on there? And then I looked up at the TV, and I could see that still get emotional.
Yes. It was a very emotional time.
It came apart.
Well, after the Challenger incident, what were your next role?
What happened is right after that, of course, I was a member of the accident investigation team, and after that was completed, the center director, who had come into play during that time, J.R. Thompson, he took over from Dr. Lucas, and he called me and said, Charlie, we're creating a new position and would like for you to take it. And he said, you'd be Director of System Safety and Reliability for the center. And I said, well, I certainly appreciate being considered, but to be honest with you, that's not an area that I would be very enthusiastic about. And I told him why, because at that time the system safety outfit had more or less been deemed as a necessary function that had to occur, but they really had not had any significant involvement in design effort or anything like that. They were more or less just strictly oversight. And I wanted to be in the doing stuff and not the oversight stuff. And so I turned it down, and then I thought about it for a few days, and I said, if they're going to make this thing work, and that's what he had told me. He wanted some people in there that knew design and how things worked and that kind of stuff. And I said, if they're going to make this thing work, they need some people like me. And I said, I can pick some more people to go with me. Anyway, I called him back and took it.
How long were you in that role?
I was in there 7 years till I retired. I was there from 87 to 94.
Okay, so you were there when the shuttle returned to flight?
Oh, yeah. Oh, very definitely. Yeah. As a matter of fact, our main focus was reevaluating all of the checks and balances that we had in place and instituting a bunch of new ones to assure that the vehicle was built and checked out the way that it was supposed to be. And all of those things, we went into the procedures and everything. They were annotated as critical functions, that this had to occur, and there was no waivers associated with them.
Very important and necessary function in that time.
It was...
you can be very proud of having done that role.
Well, I'm proud of everything we did through that time frame. It brought the centers and headquarters closer together. We established an Office of Safety and Mission Assurance at NASA headquarters, Code Q, and we had key representatives at each of the centers, especially involved in shuttle, and we had our own separate flight readiness reviews and that kind of thing, and we made presentations at the flight readiness reviews and the L-2 day reviews, making sure that we had our full vote that we were ready to launch or what our concerns were.
You could have stopped the launch, I'm sure.
Absolutely. It was, wasn't any question about it. All I had to do was just raise a hand. And, we probably had more weight than a lot of the project people.
So you saw a number of shuttle flights then? 61 of them.
61, right.
That's a remarkable record.
But what's even more remarkable is I didn't see one from outside until after I retired. They sent me back down as a VIP for one launch, and I'm sitting there in the auditorium for the briefing, and Bob Crippen, he had wound up being the center director down there at the time. He looked up there, says, "Charlie, what are you doing here?" But anyway, I did get to see my first one from outside after I retired.
Well, after you retired, what did you do?
I stayed retired for 6 years, getting frequent phone calls, about, we need some help out here. Can't you sign on with somebody and give us some help? And finally, my wife and I, we had deemed ourselves each single failure points in being able to do all of the things we wanted to do, and that's why I stayed retired that long. We traveled the world and did a whole bunch of stuff we'd always wanted to do. But finally, Sherman Jobe retired as Director of Science and Engineering, and he went with a outfit that did consulting with NASA, and he called me a couple of times, says, "I got just the thing you need to be doing over here," says, "Can't you use some extra money?" And I thought about it, and I said, "Well, if it's working for you, Sherman, I'd gone to Auburn with him. I'll give it a try." So I've been doing...
what organization was that?
That was BD Systems is the name of the outfit. And I did some consulting work with them on the solid rocket booster, as a matter of fact. And since then, I've gone with several different outfits. I'm working now with Lee and Associates on the Ares 1 upper stage, which is very similar to the S4B.
Yes. It's good that they have some old-timers who've been through the ropes working on that. That
I tell you,
augurs well for its success.
It's, we... unfortunately, the way things worked out with the funding and everything is we had a big gap during the period where we weren't able to hire anybody. So we didn't have the folks coming on right after us that had, that carryover of experience. And
the continuity was
right,
very good.
Put the younger fellows at a real disadvantage. But they've done well, I've been proud of what's been accomplished. I go into meetings, and they know who I am, and it's I'm not saying this from an egotistical standpoint, but I'm sitting there at the table and talking, and it's like they think God's talking. and then I look around the room and I realize that I'm more than twice as old as most everybody in this room. But then I think, you know, that's about how old I was when we did this the first time.
That's right. Well, are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave in the way of advice or observations to help the new generation of folks coming along?
Well, I think if I had to pick, and having been involved with all of the NASA centers in one form or another, I can't think of a better place to work than Marshall Space Flight Center. And we've, you know, the propulsion systems obviously are the most active piece of any space hardware, and you get the interplay with the man part of the thing, and you have to understand both sides of the interface in order to make the propulsion systems work the way they're supposed to. So my advice is if you can get on with Marshall Space Flight Center, just do your best, you'll be recognized.
Well, that's a very nice thought to end the interview. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, Chuck.
Appreciate your coming.
All right.